Google is currently struggling to define words like disregard, stop and ignore. The leverage shift starts now. Here is the signal that separates noise from actionable change. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. 3 days ago, users started reporting that Google's definition tool, the one that's been pulling dictionary definitions straight into search results for years, stopped working for a specific set of words. Not most words. Not random words. Words like disregard, stop, ignore, dismiss. Basic English words. The kind you'd expect any search engine to handle without breaking a sweat. Here's the problem: Google's definitions aren't coming from Google. They're being pulled directly from a third-party source, and that source just changed something about how it serves data. When you search for a definition on Google today, you're not getting a custom Google answer. You're getting a feed from an external dictionary API. And that feed broke. Why does this matter? Because Google's definition feature drives billions of searches every month. Students use it to confirm word meanings in essays. Non-native speakers use it to build vocabulary. Parents use it to explain words to kids. Creators use it as a quick reference. And right now, for a subset of common English words, that tool is returning no result at all. It's not a slow load. It's not a timeout. It's missing definitions entirely. The technical detail here is instructive. Google doesn't own these definitions. They're licensed or embedded from external sources. When those sources change their data structure, their API format, or their authentication layer, Google's feature breaks. This isn't a new problem. It's happened before with weather integrations, knowledge graphs, and currency converters. But it's notable because it reveals a fragility in Google's infrastructure that most users assume is solid. For Google's business, this is a minor blip. The search team will likely fix it within 24 to 48 hours by updating the integration layer. But for the broader tech ecosystem, this signals something more important. Even the largest platforms depend on external data sources, and when those sources change, there's no graceful fallback. Google isn't showing users a cached definition or a secondary source. It's showing nothing. The second implication is adoption and reliability. If you're building a product that embeds Google's definitions, a vocabulary app, a writing assistant, a language learning platform, you just got a reminder that embedded third-party features can break without warning. The definition API that worked yesterday might be unavailable tomorrow. This is a lesson for every startup building on top of larger platforms: always have a fallback layer. For Indian tech teams and creators, this is especially relevant. India has the second largest English learning population in the world. Tools that depend on Google's definitions are used by millions of students prepping for competitive exams, UPSC aspirants learning new vocabulary, and creators building educational content. When Google's definition feature goes down, it creates friction in their workflows. They shift to alternative sources: Oxford Dictionary, Merriam-Webster, Wikipedia. They don't come back instantly when Google recovers. What changes next? First, Google will likely prioritize redundancy for this feature. They'll either build their own definition dataset or diversify their data sources. Second, we'll see more scrutiny on API dependencies across Google's feature set. Third, competitors like DuckDuckGo and Bing will be watching this closely, ready to market their definition reliability if Google continues to stumble. The broader pattern to monitor: as AI companies and large platforms scale, they're increasingly dependent on third-party integrations, data feeds, and external models. When one of those integrations breaks, the entire feature can fail. We're seeing this with image search, with knowledge panels, with entity recognition. The systems are more powerful but also more fragile. If you rely on Google's definition feature in your workflow, whether you're a creator, a student, or someone building on Google's API, the lesson is clear: diversify your sources. Don't assume any single platform's feature is permanent or reliable. Build with redundancy. And if you're building a product that depends on Google's infrastructure, this is a reminder that you're one API change away from a broken feature. This is exactly the kind of signal worth paying attention to. Not because it's catastrophic, but because it reveals how modern tech actually works underneath the polish. Google's definition feature breaking is a small thing. But the pattern it exposes, dependency, fragility, and the absence of graceful fallbacks, is something every creator, builder, and tech leader should understand. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.